in a slightly more positive way about ourself and others can be transformational for the places we live, our families, our parishes, our communities, and ultimately our world. If you want a big, audacious goal, there's one for you. The topic that I've been asked to speak on, and I'm going to speak briefly, but I really want to kind of respond to your questions. I'll just kind of share a few thoughts about this, is this whole idea of moving from the balcony to the basement. And what we're really going to be talking about is people have kind of come to see that there's a dark side to us. Surprise, surprise. I think just because you have strengths does not mean you are perfect yet. And I want to say that pretty clearly. All of us are imperfect. Nobody gets a StrengthsFinder report that says, sorry, you don't have any patterns. Everybody has patterns, but not everybody has transformed those into productive strengths yet. And I think all of us are somewhere along that path. And so we want to think a little bit more about this darkness. People seem to be intrigued by that. And I think the basement is a great metaphor for darkness, shadow. They all have that kind of in common, don't they? I remember when I was, I think I might have been 5 years old, I had a new brother who was born in our house, so we ran out of bedrooms upstairs, so guess where I went? I went downstairs to the basement. I don't know if you've ever had a bedroom in a basement when you're 5 years old. I remember the first night that I went down to that bedroom in the basement. My dad took me down there, gave me a hug and a kiss, and said our prayers. He left, turned off the light, and I thought I was blind. It was so dark, there were no shadows in this place. And there's something about darkness that I think is kind of frightening and concerns us. So I think it is an appropriate model, and so let's just kind of think a little more about this. And we've got some great pictures of basements here. Thanks to Lisa for putting this together for me. And so our focus today, the basement or shadow side of our talent themes, common experiences related to that, and strategies to balance our use of talents productively to build strengths and to move. I think we're all in a journey at some place. There's nobody on this call or in this room that's not on some journey from the basement to the balcony. So let's all agree with that, okay? Let's be vulnerable. And I think one of the things that I think sometimes restricts that movement is we stay in the basement because we kind of hide it. We pretend that we are perfect, and we certainly are not. And Lisa's going to have a Lenten reflection about that. What takes us to the basement? Well, I think some of us are in the basement of a talent because we are immature. And some of us are immature because we are young. We have not had time yet to develop this thing. Some of us may be immature because we've chosen to be immature. We have not really, I like to think about talents as being raw talent to seasoned talent. And let me just give you an example of what I mean by that. I'll just give you the example of harmony. Some of you might have harmony theme. Raw harmony talent, maybe unseasoned harmony, is I need peace. That's what it looks like at its raw form. What it looks like at its seasoned form is this: I bring peace. I think our talents, when they are immature, they are more focused on our own needs and our preferences. And as we mature, physically, emotionally, spiritually, I think they become more focused on others, on God. That's the path out of the basement. Part of it is just a maturation process. A theme that has not been productively applied. That's another theme that really is in the basement. If you've not figured out how to use it effectively in a particular role, is certainly another way. Sometimes that's because one of the things that I've noticed is that sometimes people get stuck in what I call theme ruts. They become kind of one-dimensional. Maybe you have command. Maybe you're one of the rare people that have command in your top 5 and you use command for everything. I often tell people who work, I do a lot of work with healthcare, and when I'm working with an ER team, I'll find command in an ER room quite a bit. And I say, thank goodness you're here. Thank goodness you're here to kind of make decisions and say, okay, you do this, you do that. In fact, if I ever end up in an ER room, I hope someone there has command. Someone who will take charge of that situation and make something happen. But here's the deal. Everything isn't an emergency. You're not just one theme. And I think sometimes people get into the basement because they use one theme for everything, and sometimes at the expense of the other things that they have. They have kind of overdeveloped one theme and not developed the others. And I think that's part of what takes us to the basement. So part of what could get us out of the basement is, hey, I'm not just one thing. I've got some options here. I've got other themes that I can rely on. A theme that's been thwarted or impeded. I think sometimes when especially when we're younger, we've had these themes maybe when we were younger, and maybe we lived in a family or a community or a school where we were to some degree criticized or penalized or marginalized, not just for what we did, but for who we were. And that's painful. And I think I know there are people on this call who have been in that place, where you lived with someone, you worked with someone, you went to school with someone who thought you needed to be a different person. And it became very difficult to be vulnerable. You felt ashamed. And so I think there's darkness and shame, and so we put the armor on and we try to be somebody else, and we try to hide that in the basement. I don't know about your basement, but basement's a place where we put junk. That's part of the reason things go in the basement, because we've been convinced that what we have is not good, it's bad, and so we store it in the basement with the rest of the junk, where nobody ever goes. I don't know what we do with that junk, it just seems to kind of sit down there. So a theme can sometimes be a dark theme because it's been thwarted or impeded in some way. Also, a theme can be dark because it's been wasted or misused. You know, we just have not been very good stewards of these things, and maybe that could be because of our immaturity, or it could be because of our own sinfulness. Sometimes I don't want to use what I've got. I'd rather use something else. Maybe we've not really appreciated who we were. I think a lot of times we want to be somebody else. We think if I could just be them and have what they have, I would be happy. But the thing of it is, you're a poor substitute for someone else. You really cannot be someone else. And I think darkness comes from that. I think I've talked about this a little bit already, but I think sometimes themes become dark when they become an idol. That's what I was talking about a little bit earlier, when we become one-dimensional, when we fail to kind of appreciate our versatility, and we use that for everything. How do we move from the basement? I think that's the most important question of the day. Let's just admit it, we all have parts of us that are in the basement or some way on the stairways halfway between the balcony and the basement. I have a group of guys that I meet with every Friday when I'm home. I didn't get to meet with them today, so they were studying Hebrews 11, and I didn't get to do it with them. But and of course, I am always talking about strengths to them, and so we kind of have fun with this a bit. And we have kind of there's some of us who I would call are sensitive kind of people. We have, I would say, soft hearts, and I'm one of those. I have a soft heart. When you were talking, I just about started weeping when you started talking about all of these people on the phone here. I have a soft heart, and the value of that is empathy. I can feel emotions get into me. Now, the problem with empathy, the dark side of empathy, is I can sometimes get hurt easily. When people are not intending me to be hurt, I feel hurt sometimes. So that's the one side of this group. There are two or three of us of like that, kind of soft-hearted people. Then we have a couple of people who I would call tough-skinned people. These are people who are strong, are decisive, who they might have the theme command, we might have empathy, and we've given some great basement labels to ourselves. And we're doing this fun. I want you to know I'm joking here a little bit. We call ourselves 3 wimps and 2 jerks. But that's really, I think, to some degree what a basement... Just because you're strong does not mean that sometimes you're not a jerk. And just because you're soft-hearted does not mean that that's always an advantage. And I think that's what this is certainly all about. So let's talk a little bit about how we move from the basement. How are we doing for time here? Okay. To the balcony. One step at a time. I think the key to getting out of the basement is allowing the light to shine on who you are. And I don't think we can do that selectively. If we want people to see our strengths, we also need to be willing to see the vulnerability, is what I call it. Ability, vulnerability. With every ability, there is a vulnerability. And it's not easy to kind of be vulnerable. I got onto online and I kind of found some interesting things about vulnerability. We have phrases that kind of are pictures of vulnerability. Have you ever heard of an Achilles heel? You know, it's the part that's vulnerable on Achilles. I mean, he had this armor all over. He was protected except for this small piece that somebody hit and he was done. Ever hear the phrase living in glass houses? That's a vulnerable place to be because people they can see you, number one, and they might throw stones at you. Have you ever heard of a chink in the armor? Vulnerability is really, I think, the key to connection. If we want to connect with each other, if we want to connect with God, we have to be seen. We have to be seen wholly. We have to allow others to know who we are, both our strengths, our abilities, but also our vulnerabilities. I think the important thing is, one of the things we can do is I think we can shine the light on the talent of others. Even talent that is raw. If you have children, guess what? Their talent is raw. It's not done yet, so it's going to have a dark side to it. I'm a grandfather now. I have a hard time seeing the dark side to my grandchildren. I think grandparents are exempt from this. Parents, that's your job, to find the dark side. But I think shine the light on the talent that you see in other people. And that's my biggest thing. What I've noticed as I've worked with this for a long time is that even in strength, I call it gravity is at work. There's always something pulling us down. And I think part of our job, if we are committed to God and to the creation of human beings, is to what I call defy gravity. When you feel like something's getting pulled down to the basement, help pull it up. Notice it, point it, and bless it. Move to the balcony one step at a time. Recognize that everyone has something to contribute. If we could really, as I mentioned earlier, by thinking more positively about myself and others for the past 13 years, I have become slightly more positive. Slightly more positive. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? Stephanie's very impressed here with that. But it's interesting what slightly more positive does when you do that every day. Slightly more positive. It's like moving the angle of direction a few degrees. But if you run that out over time, you end up in a very different place. You end up out of the basement. Recall times when you've experienced the basement themes in a positive way. To some degree, I think it makes us humble. This morning, this is a good example for me. I have maximizer and responsibility. So today was a kind of the perfect storm of those two themes for me. Because I was teaching a program this morning, and needed to get that done in time to get in here. So I had 2 commitments, and I wanted to do both things as well as possible. And sometimes, you know what that did to me this morning? I woke up at 2 a.m. I mean, I think that's the basement of maximizer and responsibility. We sometimes become overwhelmed by the pressure that we put on. So I can get better at that. Although I can get by little sleep. I really am not suffering from that, to tell you the truth. But I think that's another example of that. I've got to get more comfortable with that. Apply talent positively. I think that's part of it, is realizing that, I guess the most important thing I want to say to you is that we are imperfect. That seems like a pretty simple thing to say, and it's not just you are imperfect, or we are all imperfect. And I think what I've noticed about balconies and basements is that the biggest problem, and I think Jesus had something to say about this, is that we're often more aware of other people's basements. We know what basements they live in. And it reminds me of Jesus, who said, don't pay so much attention to the splinter in that other person's eye, his dark spot. You've got a log in your own. So here's the most important thing. The only basement you can do anything about is your own. You might think you can do something about someone else's basement, but you can only move from your own balcony, your own basement, to your balcony. So I think that's all I have to say here. Maybe questions. How do we do that?
I'm going to ask you just to write on the piece of paper and for people to be putting it in the chat. So you might just look at this.
Do we chat here? Okay, I'll see if I can. I'm not used to this. No, any questions that anybody has about basements, the kind of the negative aspects of themes, of strengths?
Yes, I do. And just repeat her
Okay.
question. Would a negative side to activator be just busyness, just keeping yourself busy for busy's sake? Would that be a joke?
The question was, what is the kind of the dark side of activator? And I think the dark side of activator is speed. And usually the people who, and here's the other thing I wanted to say about these things. There are some what I would call perceived basements. Sometimes other people see a basement in you, and it may not be about you, it may be about them. I mean, there are some themes that are slower than others. Now, you think about the 2 continuum, the continuum of fast and slow. Don't put value on either one of those. It all kind of depends. I often say if I'm going to the emergency room, I want to go fast. If I'm having brain surgery, I want the surgeon to go slow. It really depends. But sometimes it's that kind of one-dimensional look at life that we think speed is always the best thing. Sometimes haste makes waste. But on the other hand, people who are, continually slowing the ball down, sometimes he who hesitates is lost. So that would be a common dark side that you might see with regards to speed, the differences in speed. Yes?
I've got strategic, maximizer, woo, learner, and focus. And I find that because I lead with strategic and maximizer, I'll woo you in to get you signed up for that committee, and then they don't see that person again until the job is done. And the rest of the time, it's suck it up, princess, we've got a job to do, and I don't care what else is going on. We got, and I'm a taskmaster in that regard. I'm trying to back off and be more empathetic, but it doesn't come naturally.
Yeah. So say your themes. Say your themes again.
Strategic, maximizer, then woo, learner, and focus.
Woo, learner, and focus. I think you've got. Yeah. The question is, she has strategic, woo, maximizer, and focus, and learner as 5 themes. And I think what she's saying is, I've got a pretty strong performance orientation. I want to get stuff done. I mean, it's thinking and doing, a lot of thinking and doing. And she says sometimes people might feel like you're a taskmaster. Is that right? And
Dawn's on top of me right now because, you know, she doesn't see that empathetic side to me. She's like, when I was, you know, one time she took the car out of, put it in drive, and it rolled backwards, and she was like, and I'm like, you're fine, what were you doing? You know, rather than hug her and
yeah, and I think part of what sometimes I find that people have to do when they have kind of, a lot of performance themes versus more people themes, sometimes people have to use, like you could use your strategic to think, okay, what are my other options here? I wonder if there are other things that I could do to be perceived as slightly more emotionally present, or just using the talents that you have to get it done. Or maybe you could make a goal. You've got focus. Okay, every day I'm going to try to say something warm or kind to my kids or whoever I'm working with. It's using your existing talent. Part of it is about being creative. Sometimes we say, okay, I could just use these themes. Strategic is thinking about how I'm going to get things done. You could think strategically about how you're going to get along with people. You could be creative that way. Use your creativity to help you in an area where you may not have quite as much natural talent, but using the talent you have to get the kind of results that you want.
We need to repeat the question.
Okay, and we've got a question. The question here from the room here is, can you publish the top 3 dark sides of each talent? Oh, the top 3. I'm not sure what that means exactly.
Well, it came from somebody with analytical.
That came from somebody from analytical. That makes sense. Yeah, they want to know what are the most. This would be anecdotal, not kind of data driven. Just in my experience, I think. What are the themes that are often kind of criticized the most? I'm almost afraid to say it. I have empathy, so I know how someone will feel in the room when I say that yours is the theme that is often... I think harmony is a theme that's misunderstood, maybe as much as anything. And we had a great discussion in the class before about this, and I wish I remembered some of the stuff that I said. No. People with harmony are really... Their talent is to manage strong emotions. That's what God created them to do, to bring peace. But the way that He gets us to peace is we don't like discord. Discord, and it's really about groups. It's not one-on-one. It's about us. It is a collaborative theme. And what it does is people get frustrated with discord, and now, don't get me wrong, harmony people are not the only people that get frustrated. One of the reasons I think it's harder for them is they usually get frustrated when other people are around. And the other people are usually fighting or kind of bickering. And so their frustration is very public. And I think as a result of that, they're seen as, they're always kind of frustrated. When deep down inside, I think they want to bring peace. So I think part of what the harmony people have to figure out, how do I deal with my frustration when I'm in a group? It's your own frustration. How can I use that more productively? So that would be one that I probably see. That's just one. Let's see. Deliberative people might be. We've got some people in the room with that. I know. People who, and I would throw analytical. I'm going to throw one of my own themes into the ring. I think deliberative and analytical people are sometimes kind of misunderstood because we think about, deliberative people think about what could go wrong, and to some degree that's kind of a wet blanket sometimes. So I think deliberative people have to think about, how do I bring the bad news in a slightly better way? How can I be more slightly positive about this catastrophe that's about to happen here? So I think part of it is, how do you deliver? How do you deliver the theme is another important way to get out of the basement. Okay, we got another. How do you get out of the basement of self-assurance? The basement of self-assurance, let me just kind of define what I think the basement of self-assurance is people who have self-assurance, I think sometimes may be perceived by other people as being independent, cocksure. I'm certain of what I believe. There's a kind of a certainty about them that is not always willing to collaborate. Sometimes they really don't care what other people think. I think the good thing about people with self-assurance is that there are times when there are not other people around to help, when you have to stand on your own 2 feet, when you have to kind of get moving forward. And so I think the thing that you have to think about if you have self-assurance is, how do I be an independent person? And obviously, here's the other thing. Nobody's just self-assurance. The reason we get into problems sometimes is we just think this one-dimensional view of self. And so I would be thinking, okay, what other themes do I have that I can add to self-assurance? In fact, I really tell people the way to get out of the basement is not to stop being who you are. That's not how you get out of the basement. In fact, I think that keeps you in the basement. When you kind of hide that part of you, how can you, what can you add to it? So it'd be interesting to know what you have that you can add to self, because self-assurance, another continuum that I would kind of think about is open and closed. I think of self-assurance as more of a closed theme. Psychologically, we would call it an internal locus of control. So I would think, what can you add to your self-assurance that might open you up a bit more? Like maybe I have some self-assurance, not too far down the list. I think I also have learner. That opens my mind a bit. It opens me to other people, or responsibility. I like to be independent, but I also, what gets me connected to other people is my desire to serve other people. So one of the best ways to get out of a basement is, what else do I have that I can add to it that might soften it, or harden it, or open it, or close it, or speed it up, or slow it down? Okay, this is from Laurent, and the question is, the person who talked about being able to get people signed up also mentioned that she had done her thing. The group she recruited volunteers for wasn't ready to deal with the recruits. My question is a lack of teamwork another form of basement? Yeah, I think some themes are more independent. I think achiever is kind of an independent, I want to get this done. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a time and a place for independence. Sometimes you are on your own. You can't rely on anybody, but there are themes that are more, some are more collaborative themes. Collaborative themes would be harmony, arranger, includer, I'm probably forgetting, consistency, I think has a collaborative aspect to it. So maybe if you have a lot of independent themes, maybe you find one of those. The other way, folks, is how you deal with a basement sometimes is you partner with someone who has what you don't have. Marry somebody who has what you don't have. That's a great way. You've got a built-in complementary partner. And I see that all the time when I see spouses that have taken the Strengths Finder. Many times it's kind of like opposites attract. And I think there's a reason for that. I think that is probably the only way, the human way, to achieve well-roundedness is partner, marry, join with another person who's different from you. But the challenge is, when people are different, they're different. There's a friction that's kind of created by such differences. And so if we, in order to kind of work well with people, we have to accept them, we have to appreciate them, as opposed to be annoyed by them. And sometimes the basement comes in how we look at people. When we look at people, we say, you've got that pattern and it stinks. That's how we have to kind of lift our eyes a bit. Sometimes it's our eyes focus on the basement of the talents that people have, and how can I think about what this, maybe it's raw, can I think about what it could be at its best? Can I help the person get it to what it could be best? Okay, we've got another question here from Beth. If someone was using their talent or thought it was a negative, how do you help them or yourself out of the basement? So I think what she's saying is, and I think it's what I said earlier, sometimes people have kept telling my whole life that you shouldn't be this way. maybe you're organized, and they said, you're just way too anal retentive here. And so people got kind of negative feedback for that. That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I think, partly I think you need to have somebody else who sees the value of what you have. That's why I think what is so dangerous about hiding your shadow side is that it keeps your shadow in, it keeps your darkness in, but it also keeps the light out. It keeps the connections out. So I think an important part of that is finding someone who will appreciate what you have. And that's why I think the church ought to be at the very center of this. If there ought to be any place where people come to be accepted for who God created them to be, even though we're not perfect, remember I said that? If there is any institution in the world that ought to be doing this at the forefront of this, it ought to be the body of Christ, because that's what He's done for us. While we were yet sinners, He loved us. Okay, we got another question here. It seems as though talking about the shadow of a strength could lead us back to a judgmental, critical approach. When is it helpful to talk about the shadow side of a strength? I agree with whoever wrote that. I think it is. I think it's okay to judge someone's performance. I think we can be critical of how someone is doing. I mean, if you're a manager and someone's not doing their job, that's a kind of a judgment. Jesus said, "Judge not, lest you be judged," and I think He was not talking about judging performance. I think He was talking about judging being, judging the soul of a person. I don't think anyone can judge the soul of another person. Now, we may have opinions about how they're living their life and what they're doing, but we should never be critical. But we are. That's why Jesus said that. Judge not. So, okay, we'll say Stephanie agrees with this questioner, whoever this. Here's another question. I have 4 relationship themes. Good for you. I'd like to be your friend. I often feel overwhelmed by strong feelings. Is there a better way to handle these? Yeah, I do. I bet you're tempted to harden your heart. I bet you're tempted to be, no, you're not tempted. So you feel overwhelmed. Yeah. So when you feel overwhelmed, does that mean you cry? Good. That's okay. I think there's nothing wrong with being overwhelmed with feelings. Now, I don't know if that means it paralyzes you. You can't act. I think there's a place in the Bible that says God counts our tears. I mean, when you count something, it's valuable. So the expression of emotion is not a bad thing. Now, somebody might have, I don't know if you have or not, but a lot of times people grow up in places where parents tell their kids, stop crying. I mean, and part of the reason they're saying it is because their heart is breaking because these people are crying, so I want you to stop. And we get the message that, I shouldn't be who I am, that it's wrong for me to express emotions. And I guess I don't think it's wrong. So that's how I would answer that. Sue Ray, got a question from you. Thanks for contributing here. Do you think the discussion of shadow strength should add value to our group sessions we conduct on strengths, or better suited for coaching one-on-one? Yeah, that's a great question. It's trickier dealing with this in a group because it's easier to get into talking about other people's barriers or other people's basements. So I do it in a group, but you have to be careful. When I do a group, I want it to be a safe place. I don't want a theme getting ganged up on by people who might have different kinds of things, and it happens. I mean, I remember being at a place where this is a group of academic deans, and there's about 50 academic deans in a room, and one of the deans had empathy. And this was a pretty cerebral group, as you can imagine, and so they were kind of kidding, half-heartedly, kidding this guy. I bet you have a hard time firing somebody. And he had a great response. He said, yeah, I don't use empathy to fire people, obviously. I have responsibility. If it's the right thing to do, I'll make the call. What my empathy helps me deal with are the emotional implications, the emotional aftermath of firing somebody. And so I kind of like dealing with it in the group because sometimes you get your best descriptions of a theme at its best from the person who has it. Most of what I know about themes I have learned from the people that I have talked to on the phone and coached one-on-one and had in most of the nuggets of truth that I know about these themes do not come from the black and white on a piece of paper. It comes from talking to people in living color. That's where you see it. So I think I answered that. Okay. Michelle, here's a question. My number one theme is belief. Basement is sometimes seen as judgmental. Yep. This manifests most with my children. I feel misunderstood and don't know how to get past this with my kids. Here's something that I say sometimes to people who have belief, and I don't know if you have responsibility or not, but sometimes when you have belief and responsibility together, they kind of they enhance each other. So what I tell people that have belief and responsibility is be intentional about making sure people know what you're for more than what you're against. What are you really for? What do you stand for? What are you fighting for? What do you care about? The positive sides of your belief, because so often it's what we're against. And I think that whenever and I'm not saying you won't be against anything, but make sure that your beliefs also contain positive things that you're for. I'm guessing one of your beliefs, you probably care about your kids, and you want something good for them. So make sure that you have a positive expression of that belief. Great, I think that's it here. So any other questions? Oh, got one right here. Great questions. Thank you. This makes my job a lot easier. I don't have to think about what I'm going to say. I just respond to your questions. Would like to hear a shadow of each strength for all 34 themes? Well, I probably could do it, but yeah, that's 34 themes. Are there any in particular? Or what are your husband's thoughts? No. Connectedness. Yeah, there's a lot of connectedness, by the way, I bet, in this room. When I work with faith groups, it's really a perspective. I think sometimes, here's what might be a barrier or a basement of connectedness. You are so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. People who are have this they live in a kind of a spiritual reality, and I know that I'm not saying if you have connectedness you're that way, but that's how some people might perceive you. And again, that may be more about them than about you, but it's a reality that's out there that you have to figure out, how do I kind of manage that? How do I make sure, even though I'm a spiritual person, that I live in the real world, that I am here as well as I'm a physical person as well as a spiritual person. I think you can be both. Yes?
How about the shadow side to strategic?
Shadow side to strategic. Tom, maybe you could talk about it. No. I think people who have strategic are always aware of options. And they really like to consider all of the possibilities and options, so they're sorting. And I think sometimes that can frustrate people who just want to get started. Let's just do something. Let's get moving. Now, I think the value of strategic is on the front end of something. When you're getting ready to do something, I don't have strategic, and so here's what I do. I say, hey, there's a road. I think I'll take that one. I haven't really thought about why I'm taking that road. And it may be the worst road in the world. I have not thought about the options, but I think what frustrates people about strategic sometimes is it takes time. It can be a slower theme unless you happen to have activator.
I was just going to comment on that. I think it's also sometimes strategic can't verbalize it as effectively as it needs to be because so much happens so fast that it doesn't come out well to other people, and therefore they miss what you're trying to say.
absolutely. I'll repeat that so that the people online, she was saying that another kind of shadow side of strategic is that it is in your head. And you may be a person who thinks very clearly and very quickly and can sort, but you may not be able to talk about what you're thinking. And so what I tell people is that if you have strategic, you have to do what my math teacher used to tell me. Show your work. Show your work. You got to the right answer. You got to the right place, but we want to know how you got there. And the other thing I say, and this goes for all thinking themes, not just strategic, it could be themes like intellection or analytical or futuristic. People cannot read your minds. If you want people to appreciate your talent, your conceptual talent, you will have to give it voice. And many times, when people have a lot of high thinking talents, communication is at the bottom.
Yeah.
I'm actually that way. I have lower communication, so I'd rather just sit and think. But when people ask me questions, I talk. Okay. Natalie's got a great question here. I was told I was too confident in a business setting by a group of men who ask about my career aspirations. I'm a woman. I have maximizer, individualization, relator, activator, and connectedness. Could this be an overused strength or gender biases? Yes. You know, I really like this question because she uses a word that I hear a lot. I am too, T-O-O, meaning I have too much confidence. And so what it implies is that the way that you solve this problem is that you get less. You reduce the confidence. And I don't like that strategy. Instead of thinking about the only way that that I could be accepted in this group is I become less confident. I think about what can you add to your confidence that might buffer it, that might make it more palatable, because to squelch her confidence, and that confidence may not be just about her talent, it may be about her experience, her education. There may be a lot of things that contribute to that. Why would you want to, how could you be too confident? And if you're being perceived that way, what could you add? Now, what does she say she has with that, or is that one gone? Let's see. She's got relator, individualization. So I would think the keys for that might be the relator, individual. Probably, it could be that people think you're too confident because you haven't gotten close to them. Getting closer to people might help them to realize that maybe you don't have it all together all the time. That might be one thing. If they really got to know you, that you're probably not as good as you appear to be. That, and of course, I don't even know you, Natalie, so I hope I didn't say too much there. Lee, how do immature strengths that focus on the individual negatively impact ministry people working together? How do immature, just went somewhere. I think the question was, how do immature strengths impact people doing ministry together? Number one, let me say, there will always be immature strengths in the church. So part of what it is, it's normal. We never get to the place where we're all perfect. So there's always going to be some tension with that. But I think it has a negative impact when we're not really firing on all cylinders. We're not going to be as good as we can be. That's why it is so important individually and corporately that we spend time thinking about who am I and how can I use what I've got to get done, and how can I really live these things and deliver these things in the best way possible. Can you hear that I'm a maximizer? But I do think it has an impact, but I don't think it means that we need to be satisfied with the way things are. This is Sue Ray. I look at the barrier label on our 34 theme insight cards for the potential potential shadow side. Yes, absolutely. That's the line on those cards. Barrier label is just another name for the shadow side, and by barrier labels we mean it's how you are negatively labeled by how other people might see it in a kind of a negative or unappreciative way. And often, to tell you the truth, I would say 40% of the time, negative barrier labels are the result of biased perceptions. It's our own biases that create these things more than the poor delivery of these things. So that's why I think the biggest way to kind of rectify this is how can I think slightly more positively about people? We got a question back here.
And I don't know if we got this one either. Did we get one?
We'll get you after this. With your years of experience, are you able to identify a balcony or basement condition in a person or identify their strengths from a short conversation? Would you avoid a person if their strengths or basement attitude agitated you, or would you work at wooing to the balcony? Here's what I say. I can't know a person just by, I'm not a wizard. And I don't want to be a wizard. I mean, I don't want to kind of take a shortcut to understanding human beings. So if you think that, and sometimes people want to get into this because they want to be wizards. They want to have people think, I know you without even talking to you. I don't think I can know anybody just by knowing their top 5 themes. It's a start. It gets me into the ballpark. It facilitates me helping get to know them. But it certainly doesn't, I got a call. So I think that's the answer to that question. I think I can know something about them, but I can't know everything about them. It's a tool. It really is a tool to help me know people a little bit easier. I think I did this one. You had a question back here. You're good at basements. What do let me tell you what balconies feel like. When you get in the balcony of your theme, number one, it's easy. It's ease, it's excellence, and it's enjoyment. It feels good, you do good, and it is fun. You know, that's what happens when you get to the balcony. You get in your sweet spot, and your sweet spot, if you stay in the balcony, kind of becomes a sweet state. It just keeps expanding. So that's why it is so important because here's the deal. We need excellence. We need ease. You know what easy is about? It's about energy. If I do the things that come most naturally to me, I don't have to work so hard. And I don't know about you, but I can use some more energy. So conserving energy is not just important for our oil stuff, it's important for I think, maybe one of the most sustainable forms of energy in the world right now, it's human talent. It is probably the most sustainable. So I think it's a great place. I think you're there. I've seen you in your balcony. Yes. Shadow side of significance. I think significance people, and I think this is another very misunderstood theme. It is, yeah, I know. I knew it was, and nobody wants that one, by the way. So I'm not going to ask anybody to. But here's the thing, folks. I love all 34 themes. I'm an advocate for all 34 themes. God put that thing, so I'm an advocate for it. I think sometimes people with significance are called that are kind of out to be seen. They really are people who want to be noticed, need to be noticed. Now, let me kind of challenge that biased view of what's wrong with being noticed. All the time, yeah. You know, I think all of us want something or need something all the time. Like I know people who have intellection. They need time to think. So I think every theme has something that it needs and that it brings. Sometimes I think people think that significance is more needy than other themes. It's not. We don't like what people need. Some of us don't like it that someone needs us to notice them. But what's so hard about noticing somebody? Jesus said, if kids ask a father for a loaf of bread, will he give them a stone? A good father gives his children what they need. And I think good human beings try to give other people what we need. And just because you need something does not make you needy. Everybody needs something. So I think that's part of this whole thing. Strengths tell us what you need and what you bring. Yes? No. The question was, couldn't this be narcissistic? It certainly could. I have talked to thousands. I don't know how many people. I talked to 500 people this year. I had 500 coaching sessions. Some of those people had significance, and I didn't see anybody who was, psychotic. They had a kind of a narcissistic neurosis. Now, I'm not saying there aren't people, but this is not really about finding those people. And to some degree, I wonder sometimes if people have become mentally ill because they've been around people who would not give them a little bit of what they need. Just a thought. Yes?
I have includer, input, arranger, relator, and positivity. And I'm in the basement of
We've got someone here who's in the basement of empathy, and she's going to tell me what that means to be in the basement of empathy.
I don't think people, I can talk to them and things like that, but it can't give them maybe what they're looking for. I don't understand. I'm a little cold. If you really want to, you can paraphrase that. But most people would never say that, but I am.
You're a little cold. So maybe it's because she has empathy, she's cold, which surprises me. And it could be that... Oh, you don't have empathy. Oh, you have includer, though. Okay, includer is a good substitute for empathy, I think. It's about other people. Absolutely. So it's another thing of how can I be more people-oriented, or is that it? How can I be warmer? It's kind of a hot-cold thing. Warm, yeah. I think some themes are warm, some are cold. Again, it kind of depends. Sometimes cold's okay. There is a place for cold. I mean, the summertime I like air conditioning. There is a place for cool. There is a place for that. But how can I be a little bit warmer? So you tell me you had. I think includer is one of the ways that you could bring some warmth into your life, because what includers usually do, they are usually people who notice exclusion.
I do.
You notice when someone's, you might notice the people in the room who haven't said anything. Now, noticing and doing something about it are two different things. Great. That is one way that you bring warmth, social warmth, connections.
It's sort of like something outside. I mean, it's not close. As an example, I went to a grief group, and these ladies were saying, oh, I'm so lost, I don't have any friends. So I called 2 of the ladies up and invited them for lunch. One never called me back, and the other one, it's okay. I mean, I feel like I've done something. But how did I mess up with this other lady?
Number one, I don't know if you messed up. She talked about how she used her includer and it did not necessarily work. She invited people and one person came, the other person didn't came. So part of that to some degree is your own rejection. When you reach out, and to some degree that's the risk. That's the risk of being vulnerable. The risk of using what you have. It's easier, it's safer to say, I could invite those people to come to my house, but they might say no. So I think I've just noticed they're here and not do anything. You did something. 1 out of 2 is not bad. That's 50%. In baseball, that's a great hitter. But I think that would be the theme that I would talk to you about. How can you use this to show warmth if that's something. The other thing, I think sometimes our self-analysis of ourselves is harder than reality sometimes. So I'd want to get some other perceptions other than your own about it. Is this person, does she need to be warmer? Thank you.
All right.
One more? I can speak quite authoritatively on that one. I think the question was, what's the shadow side of maximizer? Thank you. Maximizers can be snobs. We have high standards. I say maximizers are usually snobs about something. They want the best. I know what the best coffee is. I know what the best ice cream is. Or I know the best place to do. So part of it is they're kind of selective. They're kind of choosy, and that can be exclusive. your selectivity could exclude other people. Some people around you, they might feel excluded. Let me just give kind of a personal thing. I don't know how much time we got here.
Go right ahead.
Okay. I have two kids. I have a son and a daughter. Both are adults. They're both over 30 years old. And my son was a very good student his entire life. He was always at the top of his class. He got scholarships all different places. He went to law school, and so I was always very proud of him. I have a daughter who is 3 years younger than him, and she has a disability that we really cannot completely explain. And so from the moment she went to kindergarten, she struggled and continues to struggle to this day. Now, I think maximizers kind of sort good, better, best. And I think there's places where that's okay. I mean, if you're thinking, where's the best coffee in town? That's okay. But you can't really do that with your kids. And I'm afraid that sometimes I've done that, and it's not been helpful at all. That's been a dark side. So what I've had to learn to do, I think, okay, this is about what's the best in my son and what's the best in my daughter. Not which one is the best, not comparing them, but look, what's the best that she can be? And we're really in the process of trying to maximize her life so that she can achieve the best that she can be. But that's been a kind of a struggle for me, and I think that could be part of some other people's maximizer.
All right. Well, at least with the people here live, let's give them a hand. And I know, as you can hear the applause here on the live side, and I'm sure everyone else listening in is sharing their appreciation for all of your wisdom and insight. Thank you so much, Curt. That was wonderful. Thank you. We're going to turn it over to Lisa, who is going to lead us with a Lenten reflection on what we've just heard. Lisa?
And Stephanie, I'm wondering, do you have my slides as well? I couldn't tell from what was on the screen.
Yes, we sure do, and I'm changing you over to the presenter now. And so you can click along right there. It was the deck you sent. There you go.
There we go. Okay, super. So what I'd like to invite all of us to do for just a moment as we make this transition now from all of the incredible insights that Curt shared, I'd like just to invite each of us to take a moment and think about what we've just heard and maybe write down a word or a phrase that captures whatever struck us about the basement or shadow side of our own experience of our themes of talent. And I think it would be good for us just to take that moment to capture a little bit of this as we begin to move into just a little bit of a Lenten reflection on all of this. So I give each of us just a moment to do that. And if any of you who are on the web portion of this, if you'd like to just, jot down that word or that phrase, Stephanie will capture that. She won't announce whose word or phrase this might be, but we'll share just a little bit of maybe some of that experience that each of us have had of the basement of our themes. And as we do that, I'd just like to share with you, as I was privileged to read some of Curt's initial thoughts as we were preparing for this. And the thing that I kept thinking about as we prepared for this day were all of the times when people have asked, but where's the cross and all of the strength stuff? Or what about humility? Or what about in my weakness is my strength? And we've already touched on some of that today, and we knew that that was going to happen. It seems that Lent is the perfect time to be thinking about these things, especially because, during Lent, in so many different ways, we hear Jesus say, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. It seems that there's a healthy tension in all of this, doesn't it? The passion and death and resurrection of our Lord is the model through which we pattern and live out our lives. And our Lenten season each year is a corrective to the elements of our lives that get out of balance over the course of the seasons of our lives and activity, but also the spiritual seasons that are part of our Christian life. And yet, in the midst of that, the part of that healthy tension is remembering that we are created in God's image and likeness. And Jesus is that very image, the image of one who fulfills the Father's purpose and plan through total self-giving and sacrifice, and yes, trial and suffering and death. But even in the deepest memory of all of that on Good Friday, we don't lose sight of Easter Sunday, and we look at the whole of Jesus' life and mission and passion, death and resurrection, and all that he teaches us as one. And so I think in the midst of all of this this thought and this reflection, we realize perhaps more deeply that this isn't an either-or. It's not either talents or cross. It's not that we can choose to
For those of you that are still on the call, it looks like Lisa's just lost her audio for a minute. We're going to get her back on here because we want to hear the rest of what she has to say.
I apologize for that. Somehow, suddenly, I lost my voice connection. Are you hearing me now?
We sure are. Thank you, Lisa.
Okay. Sorry about that. It's not an either-or. It's not talents or cross. It's not that we can choose to not have talents, and we recognize that, I think, perhaps even more today. We can choose to ignore them, to minimize them, to live in the dark basement for the rest of our lives. But embracing our talents is not a denial of the cross. I think for many of us, especially people that I've talked with as I've traveled about and talked with people who are in that early exploration of their talent themes, for many of us, embracing our talents is the way we embrace the cross, at least for a while, as we move from the basement to the balcony. And we learn to accept ourselves as children of God. As Curt reminded us, we're not perfect. We're frail, we're fragile, and we're created to carry God's image into our world. And so embracing our talents throughout our lives may be the way in which we accept Christ's call and fulfill it with our lives. I was reading yesterday something that Pope John Paul II said to a group of young people in Poland in 1997 that just really seemed to have bearing on what we are thinking about today. He said this: man must be able to be more, not only with others, but also for others. And he said this truth has a fundamental significance for self-education, self-realization, for developing in oneself the humanity and the divine life given in baptism, and strengthen the sacrament of confirmation. Self-education aims precisely at being more human and more Christian, at discovering and developing in oneself the talents received from the Creator in meeting and realizing the vocation to holiness. And so as we think about all that Curt shared with us about accepting and developing our talents as a process of perhaps letting go of the negative things that others have told us and all of the time and energy that we squander in negative self-talk, embracing our talents is for all of us a journey toward wholeness and holiness. So as we think about that then, I think we realize that Jesus asks each of us to give of ourselves totally and completely. And when he speaks of denying ourselves, he's asking us to deny the tendencies within us to go easy on ourselves, the tendency toward selfishness, the tendency to avoid that sense of vulnerability. And there may be nothing more selfish than holding on to that false sense of humility, to refusing to be who we are in God's sight and who God desires us to be in the world. And so, seeing our top 5 for the first time, many of us are surprised by at least one of the themes. Others of us may be challenged on deeper reflection. And I think perhaps we wonder, is there a line between the image we carry around in our head or our heart of ourselves and the image of God planted deep within us? I was talking with Father Bill Hansen about this earlier this week, and he spoke of all of this as a crossroads. He said that he feels like there's a place where we cross from refusing to be who we are to the place where we become our talented selves. And so I wonder maybe if we need to think about that a little bit, particularly as we continue on this Lenten, during this Lenten season. Where is your crossroad, and where does it lead you? Because if we've been created in God's image, with talents planted deep within ourselves as signs of God's grace, we also have planted deep within ourselves the desire to give of ourselves with meaning, sacrificially, in union with Christ. In baptism, we're drawn into Christ's life, and as we mature, we come to understand that we are to continue to bring that life to others through our talents and gifts, through our willingness to lay down any desire to be someone other than the person who God desires us to be, and to give of ourselves sacrificially so that others may know God's love through our life and witness to Christ. And I think our talents equip us to answer Christ's call, even when doing so does require sacrifice, dying to selfish impulses, and that change of heart and mind that is so much a part of our Lenten season comes into clearer focus as a result. And so I'd like to ask you just for a moment, those of you who are on web, if you would just type in the chat box a word or a phrase that maybe captures how you have experienced the sharing of God's love through your talents. And those of you who are live at St. Matthew's, maybe you could even jot something down and share it with the person next to you. How have you experienced sharing God's love through the gift of using your talents well as good stewards of those talents? Let's take a minute just to capture that for a moment, and then we'll let that lead us into another portion of our reflection. How does giving of your talents help you to share God's love? How is that part of your Lenten journey, perhaps? I think in the midst of all of this, we recognize that we have two deep desires within. We have that desire to be our true selves, and we have that essence of which are experienced in our talents and gifts, and we have that desire to give of ourselves with meaning. And so the longer I thought about those two intertwined desires, the more of a kind of Lenten vocabulary began to emerge. And so I thought it might be good for us just to think about this a little bit together. Some of those primary themes that come out each season, but particularly each Lenten season, and see if that doesn't help us to reflect more deeply on moving from the basement to the balcony. We spend a lot of time in Lent thinking about passion, about Christ's suffering, and Christ's giving of all for humanity, and Christ's total acceptance of the Father's will. And of course that leads us to think as well about compassion, about suffering with others, and really drawing on our talents to be with others as Pope John Paul II reminded us. But I think that word is also tied very deeply to our thoughts about being passionate people. And it helps us to think about what calls us so deeply or so strongly that we're willing to suffer for it. How do our talents equip us to answer that deep, strong urge to give of ourselves? And particularly for those of us who understand ourselves as disciples, people who are taking on the life of Christ as our master teacher. And of course, following Jesus is to follow the way of one who puts God and others first, and who sees ourselves as having all we need in order to do that. And that leads us, of course, to think about sacrifice, to give of ourselves or our resources beyond what might be comfortable, rather to be vulnerable. And of course, sacrifice also leads us to think about how we allow God to draw us toward holiness. How are we a sign and instrument of God's grace? How are we people who live sacramentally? And then finally, you know, we realize the resurrection in all of this. We realize Christ's victory over all that holds us bound and all that prevents us from union with God the Father through the Holy Spirit. And so in summing up much of this, I'd just like to share with you a beautiful reflection from Father Michael Himes. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Father Himes and his work, but there's a beautiful book that he has written called Doing the Truth in Love. And Doing the Truth in Love is a series of essays that were drawn out of the service learning experience of students at Notre Dame University a number of years ago now. And in that book, Father Himes says this: "There the cross is found, because the cross is our desire to give ourselves away. It is our hunger to genuinely hand ourselves over, to give ourselves to others, because it is in doing so that we are most who we are. If you hold on to your life, you will not have life. But if you give it away, you cannot exhaust life. It becomes everlasting life. You become absolutely you. And who finally are you? You are the image and likeness of God. If God is pure self-gift, then self-gift is the image in which we are made, the blueprint on which we are built. Therefore, to give ourselves away is what we most deeply desire." And thinking about that in light of the conversation that we've been having about moving from the basement to the balcony, I'd like to leave you with one final little thought. Jesus tells us that unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. And so perhaps in this Lenten season, we might consider that crossroad that each of us faces. How might we die to the refusal to be who we truly are, moving from the basement to the balcony? And how might we die to that human tendency to hold back, keeping our true selves from others, rather than giving of ourselves with meaning, sacrificially, as the image and likeness of God, who is pure self-gift? And so as we close out this time, Stephanie and I wanted to be sure that you would know that all of the slides and the recording for today will be made available pretty quickly after this time together. I'll also be posting on CSEC this little reflection and a handout that you might use with that quote from Father Himes and a little bit more of that quote for your continued Lenten reflection during this season.
Lisa, thank you so much. And because we have a live audience here, how about a hand for Lisa Ainslinger? Do you hear that, Lisa?
I do. Thank you.
I hope you do. I want to thank our live audience for being here. It makes such a difference to have people to talk to and to speak to, and you were wonderful. And thank you to all who joined us online. It is just awesome that you've joined us. And I wanted to just leave you with the fact that we are going to continue to host these CSEC Live sessions. Our next one, we've decided to break up our CSEC Live because we want to keep bringing you these speakers, but we also want to be able to provide some practical tools. So our next CSEC is going to be a toolbox section, and it's going to be facilitator training for Strengths Group done by your very own Meredith Ellison here from right here from St. Matthews. It's going to be a virtual session, so anyone from around the country can join in, and we're going to be doing that on April 25th at 7 p.m. We want to get some evening sessions in so that more people can join us, especially those that can't do the afternoons or the mornings. The other thing is, for those of you that are not members of the Catholic Strengths and Engagement Connected community, we strongly encourage you to become a member. Since we've been doing these CSEC Live sessions, we've increased over 150 members. We're up over 450 of people all over the United States and Canada, and it has been just an amazing thing to watch, the amount of sharing and connecting and all of the things that are happening on that site. So if you are not a member, we encourage you to become a member, because there's lots of opportunity to build your own network of contacts, to be able to share what you're doing in your communities, in your faith communities, and also just get informed about all the things that we're doing here on CSEC Live and share documents. It's been amazing to see the amount of information people have been willing to graciously share on this site. We have lots of discussions and blogs going on, so if you've got a hankering for doing a blog, we'd love to have you there. With that, we would just love to have you join us and continue the conversation. So on behalf of the CSEC founders and everybody here, we just thank you all for being a part of this session. Have a great Lenten season. Thank you. Thank you.